Do we have examples of media being subsidized? You mentioned the hearings and the studies that should take place. Do we have current examples in this country of other forms of media that are subsidized in a way that can insulate them from this type of economic contraction having a negative impact on their ability to keep Black staff on staff? I mean, do we have any examples of that?
I mean, we're watching the shrinkage. Of course, one of the outcomes of the period of strong equity in the wake of George Floyd is that larger media corporations went out and they began hiring Black journalists, pulling them
Right.
away from smaller, right, lower tier Black newspapers,
Mm,
Black podcasting, Black radio, reducing those numbers, right? The brain drain
mm,
was very real. This is an area where philanthropy really could show up, right? Reinvesting in journalists, particularly investigative journalism, right? Journalists who are covering culture beats. And journalists who work on misinformation and disinformation, particularly Black, Indigenous, and other journalists of color. Investing in things like the Columbia School of Journalism and other areas ultimately help. But at the end of the day, what's going to change this is government intervention. And I'm not
mm.
talking about government demanding what media prints and writes about, but ensuring that we have a healthy journalism
Yeah.
environment in this moment. That's where the real change comes from. It has to be institutional and it has
Mm.
to drive equitable reporting, meaning every community needs to understand that its voice is being represented out there right now in the country.
Yeah. I want to talk about this brain drain a little bit because this is something that I have some opinions about, sir. I will just be very honest with you.
Yeah.
The brain drain is real, and it's not just something that happens with Black media, where Black
Yes.
reporters are, as you said, courted away or wooed away into these major corporate entities. They're assigning bonuses for some. There are just better pay rates for others. A whole host of reasons. And I want to be clear. I'm not mad at anybody trying to secure the bag. I get it. We live in an economy that is driven by your access to the bag. I'm not mad at it. I'm fortunately in a slightly different position because, I have a full-time job at a law center where that's the work that we do. This is just something that I'm also able to do, to take the work that we do at the Center for Law and Social Justice and sort of amplify it, right? So I kind of create a carve out for myself in this space because I've been able to be insulated from a lot of these economic pressures. But many of my colleagues are not in this position. Many of them are like Lurie. If I'm working at Black Writers Are Us Incorporated News, and somebody from the Washington Post comes and says I can triple your salary, just sign on the bottom. I mean, that is an attractive reality. However, sir, the brain drain is never a one-way thing. There's always the reversal. The drain gets backed up, if you will, and all of the excess talent that got taken out of these Black institutions now is surplus. They get cut from these white institutions. Maybe they have a Black institution that they can go to. Perhaps many of them do not. Can we talk a little bit about the overall impact of how that brain drain impacts us negatively in the media? And I want people to listen, not just for the media, because everywhere where we see a brain drain, we sort of see the same patterns taking place. What does this mean when some of our best journalists are taken from Black entities, plugged into these white spaces, and then abandoned when those white spaces have a corporate bottom line that they're trying to meet?
The impact is very real. It breaks down trust and credibility between that journalist and the Black community. It
Mm,
puts that journalist in an even more precarious position, right? We should understand Black journalists are paid less than white journalists, right? That is true for most journalists of color. A study by the Guild, right, which journalists belong to in 2020, showed, for in fact, that salaries had narrowed in the wake of George Floyd, but still, right, white journalists continue to earn more than journalists of color, with a
mm.
disparity of nearly 16%, right, between
Wow.
median salaries, I believe the report underlined. But the real impact of this is, right, journalists are then set adrift. The institution that they have left or were likely running, right? So let's remember,
Mm,
journalists, Black and journalists of color, don't only cover the news, right, but they are usually also the back of the journalist of the media institution themselves, meaning that they're
Wow.
probably working on sales. They are probably an editor, right? They're holding multiple positions. And so when they leave and are moving up, right, that institution also becomes weakened. And it may not be there for that journalist to return to, or other journalists to return to. And this is a real concern right now. As
Mm,
major media is cutting women and journalists of color adrift, right? We
mm.
should not assume that they're able to then go back into these institutions, these smaller institutions that were run and managed by people of color, because they may no longer exist. And we're watching
Wow.
that shrinkage as well. The number of Black newspapers that I
Mm.
grew up reading in Los Angeles and Seattle and Chicago, right, are also suffering not only brain drain, right? But also the loss of revenue as well as this economic contraction
Mm.
continues. It's a real struggle. What I would
Yeah.
say is that the answer is simply to understand this, that the press is essential to a fully functioning democracy, and no more so than right now. And we need to ensure that people of color and Black voices are heard, and Black journalists are going to have to struggle with this new reality, but they shouldn't struggle alone. It's time for
Mm.
government and Black civil rights leaders who have continued to fly the flag uh, 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 to move more diligently around these issues. They certainly have, but we need real government intervention at this point.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen a number of outlets now sort of playing with different models. I don't know if you're familiar with Capital B News. We've had a number of their
Yes,
reporters on here before. I'm a subscriber there, a paid subscriber there. Word in Black, which is another conglomerate of Black-owned entities that have sort of pooled resources together, recognizing, hey, we're gonna have to work together. We're gonna have to figure it out.
that's right.
I'm a subscriber there. And I believe that for a lot of these issues, and I want you to push back on this if perhaps I'm interpreting this inaccurately. For a lot of these issues, their only solution, in addition to fighting for government, because I want to make sure we give ourselves power work assignments on these airwaves. And so
That's
fighting for
right.
equity in media is important. So Urban View, Nubia, listen, these hearings, these studies on what's happening to subsidize, or these questions that are being raised about how we can subsidize, we the government can subsidize media in ways that are going to allow for equity to remain at the core. That is something that we need to be approaching our elected officials about. So I'm assuming, Mr. Ward, that means we should be contacting our congresspersons, our senators, and asking them, where do you stand on the contractions taking place within media right now? What hearings are you calling for, and that are you supporting, that will be able to investigate what's happening here? So that's certainly something that we need to be doing. Is another solution for us to also be supplementing the gaps left by this brain drain by becoming paid subscribers to these entities, to A Word in Black, to Capital B News, to some of the outlets that are doing this work. I know Roland Martin has his daily digital show. Even on these airways, this isn't a Black-owned space. We're Black-facing. But, so I'm wondering, do we need to be, as a Black audience, because I'm very concerned about what these gaps mean for disinformation and misinformation campaigns, which are now internationally epically powerful at disrupting the flow of accurate information into our communities. Do we also have the responsibility of putting our money where our eyes should be in terms of media and financially supporting these institutions as well?
Absolutely. Look, the average employment by newspaper publishers has already gone down 63% since the
Wow.
1980s. And there's going to be a further
Wow.
decline, right? We anticipate, right? And I think this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Someone can Google that to fact check. But a 2021 study by the Bureau of Labor Statistics shared that there would be a further decline of 4.8% by 2030. And so we
Mm,
have to understand two specific things need to happen in this moment, right? We cannot allow journalism to die in America. And if the
mm,
misinformation surrounding COVID and masks and vaccines and January 6th and attacks on Black history don't help us understand the importance of actual trained journalists, right? We are putting ourselves in real harm, right? We have worked 75 years to advance civil rights in this country, and it is now facing a backlash. That is the backlash against democracy. It is a backlash against the civil rights gains in this country. We have much more to go, but we have to hold ground. We don't do that without an informed public. So one, it is getting on the phone with your senators, and it is demanding, right? Not asking, demanding that we have a fully informed public, and understanding that doesn't happen without diverse newsrooms. The second, right, is to continue to focus, right, on news outlets themselves. And yes, we should support and subsidize Black journalism. And that means giving to institutions, right, that are hosting and developing Black journalism and other journalists of color. That is essential. That is one way we can make a difference. And we can't become reliant just on those, right? At the end of the day, as strong as those will be and as influential as they will be, right? We still need to make sure that there are equitable CNNs, MSNBCs,
Right.
ABCs, CBSs, and that doesn't happen without calling up senators.
And we've seen recently that those places that you just named have been really good at whitening their spaces. And by that, I mean, it was like overnight, the Blackness just faded to white. And I mean, and everyone was sort of taken up with the way in which Tiffany Cross from MSNBC was dismissed. And I'm rooting for that sister. I do believe. But as that was happening to her in that very public way, we also saw a number of Black and brown faces that were a part of the early morning shows, the late night shows, weekend shows, completely disappear. And I've been following a number of them. Not all of them have landed somewhere else. And so, as you mentioned, that brain drain and then sort of being set adrift is something that is really going to have a multifaceted approach. Both our support for the Black-owned institutions that are doing the work of raising up Black journalists, and also these demands and contacting our elected officials to demand that they ensure that CNN, MSNBC, all of these spaces which use our public airwaves are going to have an equitable access to the reporting that we all get and gain access to.